Welcome to this episode, everybody. I'm here today with Donovan Cleckley, who's a writer and writes about LGBT issues, gender identity, ideology, and I'm so excited to be speaking with you, Donovan. I was just reading an article of yours, a recent one about the history of lobotomies and these brain surgeries and relating them to the current transgender medical industry. So I want to get into all of that with you and learn a little bit more about you and about your work and everything. And so first of all, just thanks for joining me. How are you doing? How have you been?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sasha. I've been wonderful. I am so glad to know that you got to read over the article. I'm always thrilled when people read over any of the writing and give it any time. I think the subjects covered that we write about at the distance, especially, are difficult to write about, to discuss, but they are necessary. They matter for us to understand complex issues around medicalization, not only in terms of psychosurgery and the lobotomy of the past, but also what has been advertised under gender affirming care and transition in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's quite an accurate analogy, it seems like, from what I have been reading. And it's really disturbing. I was also going and reading a bit more about the history of lobotomies after I read your article. And I mean, it's really gruesome. Like, there was this surgeon who used the ice pick, and he would go in behind people's eyes and he would just use electric shocks to like knock them out and not even use any anesthesia or anything and then just stab them through the back of their eye sockets. And this was all in the name of like curing them and improving life and improving society. And it had, these eerie echoes of the trans surgeries for sure. So it's definitely an apt comparison. And how did you first get into writing about this stuff? Have you always been a writer?
For me, I always had been drawn toward issues related to women's rights and gay rights. My my primary interest was always literature, and specifically like Victorian literature, because I love to read the works from the 1800s, whether we're thinking about the Bronte sisters or Wilkie Collins, whom I've been reading about most recently. Um, I also had an interest in social movement rhetoric, and so like the development of like the early women's rights movement in the 1800s, in not only in the United States but also globally, um, as well as in the UK. So thinking about the way that there has been social change, this kind of study, this line of study, got me into really being invested in issues that impacted women, and also lesbians and gay men, and issues around basic human rights. Um, that that sort of topic was always something that I had been drawn toward. That exploration of those issues connected to women's rights and lesbian and gay rights, because of the way that forms of medicalization have been so intertwined and bound up in how society has responded to the rights claims from women and from people who are classified as deviant, or people who are seen as um, they're seen as criminal or ill in a certain way. And so when we look at psychiatric abuses, I think there is this um, there is this logical way that, the interventions like lobotomy had been used for the purpose of social control, through medicalization.
Let's go back a little bit. I just want to ask you, just to set the stage a little bit more, about yourself. Do you have a personal background in any of these things? And also, do you have you experienced like a lot of backlash, or have you come under fire? I'm curious about that.
So in my case, I've been gender nonconforming and gay, that is homosexual.
I
So
like how you have to clarify. Like this is what
I have,
this means.
I have the, yeah, I have to say like the homosexual kind, like
Not
the
the happy
actual,
kind.
not the happy or whatever the kids are doing on
Right.
on
Right.
social media, not whatever that is. And so for me, it was natural to have concerns about it, especially as it impacts, young people, boys, who are like I was when I was growing up. So I had that as far as my personal reasons for the concerns. And in terms of like having to deal with like backlash, personally or professionally, I really did not. I had friends who drifted away, and it was not really like the end of the world because they just did. I did not really like sit down and feel too awful about it, because if I do have to completely like censor and alter myself around people and completely like muzzle all of the concerns that I have, just to please those people, then I have no reason to keep them in my life or to want to keep them in my life.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. That's no,
I
that I
know.
like that. I think that's an encouraging statement, especially a lot of people have gone through exactly what you described, kind of the drifting away process.
Mm.
And there's maybe nothing definitive, maybe there's no big argument. Even if there is, though, what you said applies. I mean, if someone is making you have to censor yourself, like you said, that they're not a great person to be around for sure.
Yeah, and I I always thought about it in terms of needing to be able to speak about the issues and to express concerns in a way that was reasonable, but while also maintaining my integrity as a person, as an individual, and that sense of integrity matters to me. And when it comes to the engagement with the issues, I had a sense of the literature, that related to the women's movement, the early movement, and going into the latter half of the 20th century. So the second wave feminist movement, and of course, the literature of the gay liberation movement. So I had an understanding of these earlier eras in activism, and that that and my personal experience in terms of having both the the knowledge of the movements and then the personal experience that I have helped me in terms of, engaging or feeling a sense of, urgency to jump into an issue that otherwise a lot of people would stay out of,
Mhm. Yeah.
would just
Just,
not,
I'm not gonna get
uh,
involved. That's old,
right.
kettle of
Um,
worms. And it's interesting also that you come at it from the perspective of a gay man. And so for people to, I mean, turn their backs on that and say, "Oh, you're just a bigot," because I know you've written about, of course, the bigotry accusations, which is the classic thing. Of course, anyone who speaks out about this gets labeled a bigot. Um, and the friends who kind of drifted away, I'm just curious, were they straight friends? Just because that would be so ironic if it was straight people telling you as a gay man, like, you're bigoted against, the LGBT community.
so interestingly, it was mostly straight people,
Mm.
and oddly, it has been pretty biased toward like women in terms of those who are afraid of being around heretical people or
Mm.
people who are deemed heretics, which is not surprising. I think people on online make a big deal about how so many women are devout followers of transgenderism, and I think I think it is a pretty observable fact when you think about like a lot of the religious fundamentalisms of the world. They depend on the support of women, on a large support from women that maintains the backbones of those religions. So when it comes to transgenderism, why would it deviate from that? And so that is how I think of it when it's that kind of that strange number of women who suddenly betray their interest and like and think and think
Yeah.
think whoa, like men and women's sports, yay, right? like
Right.
like
Right.
they're
Just try
they're
harder
they're
if you're not
right,
winning. Yeah.
when you think about these women who are flag waving for the destruction of women's rights, it it makes sense in the context that there have been women historically uh, who have been very, very attracted to, I mean, even to like, not just to say religion generally, because religion generally is not always necessarily bad, but when you think about like fundamentalist movements, when you think about these movements that have zero like zero positive benefit for women,
Well,
like
and
like,
cults too is
mm-hmm,
another thing that's popping into my head as you say this, is like the Jonestown cult. A lot of
mm-hmm,
women, right? And they drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, it's well, because we are the sex who is, or that is more susceptible to a social contagion and sort of um these things that catch socially. And also, I think, what you're also referencing is the movement has gone, I mean, it's the feminist movement, apart from the non-mainstream, like the radical feminists, the overall feminist movement is 100%, pro-trans, pro-queer theory and all this stuff. So for a lot of women, they think they're being more virtuous. They would be confused by your comparison to the anti uh feminists of history, because they would think, well, but we are the feminists because they are the liberal feminists and they sort of have to sign on to everything there. But yeah, there's this enthusiastic, well, wasn't it also, there's a story about, it was women who would say like, oh, she's a witch, burn her, a lot of times with the witch trials.
there was or there were kind of ways that women were used for the purpose of like accusing other women. Arthur Miller dramatized it in The Crucible, where it was the young girls who accused women around them in the community of being witches, and that the only time these young girls and their words and the women's words were taken seriously was in the context of it being used to paint another woman as a witch, ironically.
Yeah,
And
that's interesting.
it was the only time that the
Right.
words are really taken seriously.
Right. And so
So
maybe there's an echo of that in like she's a transphobe,
mhm.
you can gain this street cred among your woke friends
Yeah,
by
I mean
trying to cancel people for transphobia.
the denunciation of turfs has a has an enormous social capital among crazy people. Like
I love how
it
you said
has
that. That's a great quote.
has,
Yeah.
has it's true. I mean, it has great social capital, but I mean, it is good. It is like having the most monopoly money, right? Like you have all this monopoly money, but if you try to actually take it to a real bank, it will not work.
That is
I
so
would say,
funny. Unfortunately, it sometimes works because the real
I mean,
banks
yeah,
agree, but
I mean, they will, that they can turn, um, turn a grift on it, as it were. There are more people, I think, in the public who are becoming critical of these issues, and especially with pediatric transition, that issue has actually it has in my view turned a lot of people more critical than they ever would have been had trans activists simply opposed pediatric transition and said nothing under 18, no puberty blockers. In my view, they would have a significant amount of support, significantly higher amount of support than they have now, because in reality, most of society, I think, would lean toward the more libertarian, individualistic kind of argument for adults.
right,
Um,
right.
but the activist emphasizing children has led to more scrutiny on the practices, especially in terms of pediatric gender medicine, but also gender medicine more generally,
Yes.
as it even applies to adults. Um, which it is interesting how in them trying to push and push and push and expand it to encompass children, it has led to it backfiring, and meaning that not only is pediatric gender medicine being rejected, but also the broader practices in gender medicine have come under scrutiny.
Right.
um,
I have to jump in quickly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's exactly what happened with the prison issue, where trans activists overstepped their boundaries so much that they lost I mean, I remember hearing this from someone who was working on one of these, one of the, I think it was a FOIA request around how many male prisoners were actually
mm,
being transferred. And there was some, um, sympathetic trans activist who said, if the really radical trans activists hadn't done this, we would still have the policy that kind of worked for us, which is where if someone actually had the surgery, they would get transferred and there weren't really a lot of issues. Now, I don't personally, think that that should be the policy, but trans activists shot themselves in the foot, or rather, they shot real transsexual people in the foot with that one,
mm,
by just saying, like, oh, well, anyone who self declares as a woman can go into a women's prison, and now there have been rapes and impregnations already. So, um, what you're describing about how they've overstepped so far, and it's absolutely true that people would be a lot more sympathetic to adult medical transition. That's a whole nother discussion. And I've noticed a lot of the people who are really big voices against the pediatric transition, they always kind of clarify, like, I don't speak about adults, or I don't, necessarily
mm,
support a prohibition on that. I believe people should get to decide what they want to do. And they don't go as far as to say all of it should be banned. So yeah, I mean, you're making a great point. And I have to ask you, I'm curious what you think though about adult transition, the medicine. Do you think that it is something that people should be allowed to decide that they want to go get, like in the same way you could decide to go get another kind of plastic surgery?
So, my view on it is that I think gender affirming care should not be advertised or sold to people as a form of mental health care. It should not be utilized the way it is as this argument for the prevention of suicide, first and foremost, because I think that that kind of advertisement and branding, and it is advertisement and branding, does harm to people who have underlying issues, other medical issues, mental health issues that actually need to be addressed and need to be explored. So on that level, I don't think that it needs to be given to people as this kind of health care, as this in the domain of something that's actually treating mental health. Because I think that it is something that is separate and that it operates outside of that domain. Interestingly, trans activists, when you push back and talk about this with them, they will say something like, well, cis people have all sorts of gender affirming care that they get. Think about breast augmentations. However, do women get breast augmentations as suicide prevention? No.
That's a good point.
So,
That's a good point.
so,
Usually my retort is like, well, a breast augmentation doesn't damage. Well, no, but I mean, it can, but it's not,
mm,
the outcome is not necessarily that it will destroy the function of the body
mm,
part, which is the distinction that I always draw. But I think that's a fantastic point that you just made as
mm,
well. That this is branded as a suicide prevention, and that is unlike any other, and that
yeah,
would, unlike any other cosmetic surgery, and that would raise such a big red flag, wouldn't it, if you
yeah,
were going in for a nose job or a boob job and you somehow had this idea, or the surgeon had this idea, or anyone did, that it was going to prevent you from killing yourself.
right. I mean, I imagine going into the doctor and saying like, I want the best like rhinoplasty. I want like a crazy sharp nose. Make it, make it a pencil nose. And oh, by the way, I'm doing this because it will prevent me from killing myself. That to me is ridiculous. It is ridiculous to pretend that a surgical intervention can can radically improve or can improve at all a person's mental health. From my point of view, there is always something deeper there that actually needs to be dealt with for each individual, and a scalpel, a pill cannot accomplish what working with a therapist, going through psychotherapy can do. And the point that I'm making too is not to say that the person should be forced to adhere to stereotypes in society, because trans activists immediately jump to saying, oh well, so since you do not believe in my body parts being cut or being medicalized, then you must believe in forcing people to adhere to the stereotypes. And I do not think that either. I think there is this wonderful other option where people can exhibit non-stereotypical behavior and it not be medicalized. It is such a wonderful other option here that has not been explored. and they, because they act like either you have to rigidly adhere to the stereotypes, or if you do not, then you have to be medicalized, and it's either one or the other. And in reality, you can not rigidly adhere to the stereotypes, so you can exhibit the non stereotypical behavior, and you do not have to be medicalized. As so the trans activists, they come at it from an entirely unimaginative point of view, which is
I like that.
that they pretend that everybody else lacks imagination, right?
Hmm.
They pretend that the bigots, the people who are out there, the turfs, all lack imagination, but in a very profound way, they have a kind of poverty of imagination. They cannot imagine a different world, or a different self. That is not medicalized. They think only in terms of purchasing the authentic self, rather than that the self simply is. And that's one of the things that I've always found paradoxical too, um this idea of the authentic self that can be obtained through pills and procedures and all manner of costs and expenses, and the daily, the constant harm done to the body. It is the least authentic. It is the most artificial, and people lie to themselves. They end up having to, or feeling as though they must live in an illusion.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole concept of having to medicalize in order to reach the authentic self, and you put it so well. Um, it's it's something I keep hearing over and over again, and it can bring us back to our discussion of lobotomies and the history of that. I was interviewing Shapeshifter, who is, you're probably familiar with him. He's on Twitter. He's a detransitioner, but it's complicated. But he did, because I think medically it's complicated. So I don't think he's 100% detransitioning medically, but he had this horrible experience with transvaginoplasty, and he went in for the original surgery, the penile inversion, and then he ended up having to get numerous revision surgeries, and he has been left traumatized and with this just a horrible set of problems with it. I wrote a profile about him on my Substack, but he talked about that he was he growing up as a gay boy and being bullied and just beaten down for it, and wanting to be accepted and accept himself, really. And then he was sold this bill of goods by therapists, by the trans movement here in the US, because he's not from here. And he described the surgery as a sexual lobotomy, which is such a powerful statement. And he said, I mean, no sensation down there. There is phantom pain, which is just so heartbreaking. But no sensation, no libido at all. It's all gone forever. And so I mean, the reference to lobotomy there, and you've brought this up in your writing, the history of um the psychosurgery, is that what it's called?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
So, mm,
yeah, so let's talk more about that. Let's get more into the history of the lobotomies and what made you make that connection and everything.
So with the lobotomy and psychosurgery, the lobotomy is part of it. It is an earlier iteration of what became psychosurgery. So when we think of the prefrontal lobotomy, we have the procedures that were performed in the 40s into the 50s, that were the ones that were the particularly grim ones, and then they got a facelift into psychosurgery, where it was the return. It was coming back under a different name. So it had left, or so everybody thought, or so people thought, and then turned around and it was coming back, and it was just going by a different name, essentially, even though the practices were celebrated as better, or more improved than they were in prior decades. Psychosurgery continued, a kind of psychiatric dehumanization that persisted even into the 70s. There was this interesting article, and I'll quote from it, from the American Journal of Nursing, and it was put out in 1947. So this is during the those earlier iterations of the lobotomy, specifically the prefrontal lobotomy. And what one of the quotes says, and this was in a piece. It's called "Psychosurgery: The Nursing Problem," and it was about the care for patients. And it was written by Florence Ewald, Walter Freeman, who is one of the major figures in the lobotomy, and James W. Watts. And there's a passage that says, "Our main concern here is with the important problem of retraining the operated individual. Prefrontal lobotomy has the effect of a surgically induced childhood. As the patient first emerges from the confusion, listlessness, and inertia that immediately follow a prefrontal lobotomy, he presents an altered personality, which is not at first a healthy personality." So there was an understanding that the lobotomy, it created what they refer to in that article as a surgically induced childhood. That the point was to essentially, cut upon the individual, make the person regress, and or to keep them in this kind of childlike state, which, when you think about puberty blockers, performing a performing a similar practice of a medically induced childhood upon a cohort of people. And when you have the surgical procedures performed on people that render them, without sexual sensation, they're being nullified in a way, that it is a surgically induced nullification of sexuality, of the sexual feeling, of sexual orientation itself, right? When you've completely negated feeling, negated expression, it is controlling sexuality. So in the case of a homosexual male, right, like we think about, yes, you can feel it in this kind of intellectual way. You can feel, but then your body has been nullified. It's been controlled in such a way that the body cannot even express the desire. And that kind of control, that kind of medical control, is exactly what I was meaning when I talked about how it limits people, how it places limitations in a way that activists are not willing to talk about. They do not talk to people about the limitations. And moving from like 1947, when we think about the early responses to psychosurgery in the women's movement, in the second wave women's movement, we have papers like the second wave, which was put out in the 70s. It ran through the 70s into the 80s. And in one of the articles by Barbara Roberts, and this piece will be one that I cover in the distance, she did a piece called Psychosurgery, the Final Solution to the Woman Problem, questioning the use of psychosurgery as a way to control women, especially because there actually was a relatively high number of women who were being referred for psychosurgery. As I point out in the piece that I did for the distance, when there have been reviews of the medical records, they have found that it goes up into the 2/3 of patients have ended up being female, who have been taken in for lobotomies. And the authors are always really interesting when they talk about this, and like why it was the way it was, and they have to pretend that that, oh well, like we had almost, that they'll have statistics that show like 66% and up of women, being put through lobotomies. And on the one hand, they will suggest, well, it could mean that there was simply like a higher prevalence of mental illness or of these issues among women. But then the other thing, and this one I think is more likely, is the kind of second class status that women had in society. And I think that second one might be the dead ringer, because I think the second class status has a has a big impact on why these people are specifically designated, for surgical intervention, for a kind of simple classification into a medicalized category. And in the piece from the second wave, what I really thought was interesting that Roberts covers is she talks about the specifically like the way that medicalization can be used to control what is perceived as deviance, which we see in the case of gender affirming care, in quotation marks. And here's what Roberts says. She says, "We are dangerously close to a society in which everyone who deviates from the norm will be vulnerable to surgical mutilation. The increasing application of these methods to neurotics and to people who are well enough to work raises the specter of wide-scale application, particularly to women who continue to be the majority of victims. Unlike burning at the stake, psychosurgery can silence rebellion while preserving the useful work women do with their hands, their backs, and their uteruses." And she says, "The vision of a society of placid human robots, remotely controlled by computers, is not far-fetched. Society has never developed a weapon it did not use. It is up to us to keep the weapon of psychosurgery from falling into the hands of our compassionate rulers." Now, when you think about gender-affirming care, and the way that it's utilized for the purpose of controlling people, the way that it controls something as particular as the sex drive, for each person, that it works in such a way that it places chains on sex and sexuality. It is an extremely effective and widely applied form of social control. In that sentence, where she says, we are dangerously close to a society in which everyone who deviates from the norm will be vulnerable to surgical mutilation. That sentence is like hauntingly true for the way that people now, especially younger people, get, they go to the gender clinic. And so when, various detransitioners have talked about it in terms of a sexual lobotomy, I think I think they are right when they say it is a sexual lobotomy, and that it functions at that level. And then more seriously, there is the cutting on the body, that is, the removal of sensation, the kind of like ghost pains of like a part that's gone. That also functions to control people, to control them emotionally, to keep them in a kind of emotional straitjacket, and also a sexual straitjacket, because when your body has been cut in these ways, when it is numb, when there's numbness, when there's a lack of feeling, it it presses upon you. It again goes back to that metaphor of the cage. It's the cage that it closes in. And the psychiatric establishment has unfortunately really become a part of the way that people's bodies become fashioned into cages, through the use of psychosurgery, through the use of differing forms of medicalization. Um, as a side note too, I wanted to mention, earlier research, or earlier analyses of these conditions. There was a publication that came out, and this was in the 70s. It was 74. This was called The Radical Therapist, and of course these were leftists of the time who were critical of the use of medical intervention when it came to issues of sexual orientation, and when it came to dealing with such things as women's oppression. That we cannot simply throw every issue into the medical domain. And these early activists, these critiques were extremely important. There is a passage about the treatments that homosexual people experienced as a result of the psychiatric establishment and profession attempting to control sexual orientation, control sexuality, and essentially to control sex itself. So we saw, even in earlier decades, attempts by psychiatrists, by medical professionals, to exert this control, to extend the medical domain where it should not go, where it is not needed, particularly in human behavior. When it does get into controlling human behavior um, to reshape society, as we have seen in the cases of eugenics, right? Like eugenics meaning to completely reshape society, control human reproduction. We see medicine engaging in a kind of overreach that it
Yeah,
it never like it never should have extended there. It should have
right, right,
stayed
right.
away.
It should have stayed with the healing of the
Mm,
sickness of the body rather than like getting into all these spiritual psychological issues. Not that there's not a place for psychology in medicine,
mm,
but I really I appreciate what you're saying about that medicine had this overreach. And I can't remember who I heard recently say this on some podcast, that people have started to come to a psychiatrist or a therapist in the same context where they previously would have gone to a spiritual
hmm.
guide of some kind. And
So
because that's who we have available in this day and age.
that point is very important and fascinating, because it has been discussed by writers like Thomas Zaz, who was a critic of psychiatry, and he's talked about it as the doctor or the physician comes to replace the priest. And instead of going to the priest to have confession, we go to confess our sins. We go to the doctor, and we have our, we are having a checkup where we are confessing our symptoms, right? Right. So it is this kind of uh, uneasy uneasy way in which medicine has risen to the level of a religion. And there was Janice G. Raymond, who wrote The Transsexual Empire in 1979, also did an essay in around the early 80s, I think 82, that was titled Medicine as Patriarchal Religion. And she actually discussed how, like, and she had been in the Catholic Church at one time, and so she parallels how medicine has and it even more now had set itself up as a kind of church, a usurper of the church, as we went into an age of reason. There was less of an emphasis on religion and on, like, people going to church. So what fills the gap but medicine?
Medicine. It's so
And
interesting. Another quote just popped into my head when you were saying that. And I don't know if this is from Dostoevsky himself, but I think I read it in The Brothers Karamazov, that the church is not a courtroom for sinners, it is a hospital for sinners.
mm,
And so, it's really interesting what you're saying about how the literal hospitals have now taken over the role of the mosque or whatever it was. Yeah, so continue. I just wanted to
yeah,
interject
that
that.
point from Dostoevsky is really great. And you see the medical metaphor utilized throughout literature as it applies to the church, because the connection between, like, the physician and the priest and the symptom and sin has been an ongoing historical parallel, that has pretty, like, wide usage in literature. And there is a quote that I was thinking of too, and I've talked about it before. When you think of what Nietzsche said about, like, the death of God, right? He's always quoted as, like, "Oh, God is dead," yada yada yada, and as if it is this thing that means, oh well, so he just thinks religion's stupid. Well, he did not like religion for reasons, but his point with, like, the death of God was actually when society moves away from that religious sensibility, or that kind of sentimental connection to the idea of God, when society has realized that it has killed God, or that it no longer needs a God. um, what fills the gap of religion? What fills it? What will it put in the gap? And medicine. Medicine is one of the things that it will fill in the gap of religion, which is why, even though I am not a believer, I still think having religion in society matters. I mean, it matters in moderation, obviously, not the fundamentalisms, not the not the extremist kinds, but for people to have spirituality matters in society, because otherwise they will, in my experience, they will seek it in all manner of things. Where I have witnessed people in my life who have gone to. I mean, medicalization is one of those. I have seen people go toward transition and toward, like, body modification, because it was a substitute for having some kind of deeper sense of spirituality. And that is disturbing. It is disturbing to see it, because my sense of spirituality and connection to others is through service, is through being able to work with people. When I work with my family at the laundromat, being able to talk with people to help them. I find meaning in those interactions with people, in being able to help people. I also teach. I do some reading comprehension work with students. In eighth grade. Some of them have been in high school, some in college. I've worked with adult learners. And for me, the sense of communion that I have with other people it fills that need for something beyond me, because I know that I'm giving to others, that I'm sharing, that I'm actually contributing back to the lives of other people. And that kind of feeling is so important. And without that, and without any kind of sense of greater importance to others' lives, we we fall into all manner of of terrible, horrible situations, and become most easily taken advantage of, most easily exploited. So that was something that I experienced with thinking about uh, what what it means to have a sense of the self in relation to others, and not isolated, not alienated from other people, but a sense of really giving back. And then therefore you feel a reason that you're there. It's not that you do not have to go to a doctor or clinician and be told that you have a reason to exist, that you that you exist, right? Because one of the rhetorical red flags from trans activists is all the talk about having the existence erased, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you are erasing my existence. Well, what if they had a sense of self that had nothing to do with being medicalized, nothing to do with being validated by either a medical or clinical apparatus, or having to have people submit to them in public 24/7? What if they would have an existence? They would have an existence away from demanding submission from others. And so that was one of the things. And when it comes back to medicalization, I wanted to mention um, one of the works that I've been reading that I just got in the mail, which I've been so excited about, is this book called "From the Neutral Body to the Posthuman Cyborg" by Silvia Guerini, and it's from Spinifex Press. The press publishes really wonderful books, and this author, she writes of in a similar vein to Janice G. Raymond, and with kind of aligned to Thomas Zaz as well, in terms of this critique of medicalization interfering in the moral domain, in this case in the political and the social and the economic. And she says, medicalizing suffering related to stereotypes puts the individual in the hands of the medical and pharmaceutical system, and thus, instead of changing the structures of society, those individuals who do not fit the stereotypes will receive treatment. That instead of changing society to be more accepting of those non-masculine boys, of those non-feminine girls. That instead of changing the society, instead of having these small reforms that over long term make a big difference, we take the individual and treat her or him as a patient, as effectively as a sinner, uh, and that irony is something that I have found like embedded in trans activism, that it argues that we should not pathologize gender nonconforming behavior, but it also believes in gender affirming care,
Yeah, it's a
which
contradiction. It's a serious contradiction there.
which if in order to have like gender affirming care, you have to pathologize. Like
Yeah, they can't have it both
you,
ways, but they do
you
they do try to have it both ways.
right, like it goes back to that idea of doublethink, right?
Mhm.
From Orwell's novel. Um, and Janice G. Raymond, her most recent book, Doublethink: A Feminist Challenge to Transgenderism, it came out in 2021. And she discusses these kinds of contradictions, where there is, on the one hand, this belief that we should totally enable all gender nonconforming behavior, and it should not be pathologized. Which, when they say it should not be pathologized, what a wonderful idea! So now you are going to abolish gender affirming care.
Right.
and
And then they're
and
like, wait a
they,
second.
and they say, oh wait, oh oh, and I'm like,
Hmm.
well, that is a form of pathologization. It is a pathologizing act to medicalize something. Um, so it is interesting. I mean, and we know trans activists harbor so many contradictory ideas, including like they will say, thinking about stereotypes, like, well, of course, the men who declare themselves women do not do so on the basis of stereotypes, and then the men who do so on the basis of stereotypes, and so I'm like,
Right. Yeah.
like, yeah, and it is the same with the medicalization of kids. They will argue, well, we should not pathologize these kids, and then they proceed to pathologize those kids.
Right. To the point
Yeah,
where they call it life-saving healthcare.
right. I mean,
And
and
doctors repeat that lie. It's
and they will claim that there is no coercion into gender affirming care, but when you say it is life saving and imply, if not outright say it, that people will kill themselves if they do not receive this care, what you have effectively done is you have utilized the rhetoric of suicide for the purpose of coercion, to coerce people. That is the point of it. It,
right.
it. it is the point of the suicide threat is coercion.
Donovan, I think I'm gonna start to wrap us up there because it's getting late and we've hit about an hour. I've so enjoyed speaking with you. You have a wonderful way of speaking and articulating and just almost poetic a little bit how you talk. So I really enjoyed listening to you. I hope we get to talk again sometime. You bring a lot of really great insights to the conversation. And where can people find your writing and support you before we end?
Yes. Thank you so much, Sasha. And people can find me on Twitter, where I am most active. I write on Substack, both my own Substack, but also primarily for The Distance. I have a few pieces on it so far. I've been a regular writer for it. I have some pieces in the works. One that will appear on Fairer Disputations, which I am really excited about soon. So I can be found mostly on Twitter. That is where to look for me if you are trying to find the writings there. Uh, and and otherwise, at the distance, please do follow us. We have really great pieces that we put out, and we also do weekly, or kind of weekly-ish sometimes, story kind of story hour sort of thing, where we get to talk about different fairy tales and some issues related to um, gender critical analysis and current issues surrounding the medicalization of kids. So that is where I can be found and work can be found.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'll definitely link those below so that people can easily get to them. And please, if you're not already, go follow Donovan on Twitter, check out his writing, and hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for joining me.